By the early 18th century, most of the mainland colonies were royal colonies, that is, colonies directly administered by the British government rather than by a corporation or a private proprietor. Government in the colonies was modeled on the English system, with bicameral legislatures, a lower elected assembly, and an upper house, typically appointed by the governor. The royal governor was the chief executive, whose position was somewhat similar to that of the monarch in English government. In fact, in some ways, these colonial governors had even greater power, since they could generally dissolve the lower house of the legislature at will, control the elections of their speakers, and in most colonies initiate legislation within their appointed councils, the upper house. However, there were significant checks upon the power of royal governors. Governors and judges, for example, received their salaries from colonial legislatures, not from the British government. Understandably, this gave colonial assemblies considerable power over these royal officials. The growing strength of colonial assemblies encouraged the development of democratic sensibilities, but with significant limitations. Groups like women and African Americans could not vote, and property qualifications for voting typically ensured that the poor were often disenfranchised. Social deference was still a part of the political culture, and the colonial legislatures were dominated by key elite families, generation after generation. By the late 17th century, economic, demographic, and social shifts were causing changes in the older settled regions. In the Chesapeake, for instance, we see a sharp drop in the mortality rate, probably due to better diet and improved resistance to epidemic diseases. This change had a number of consequences. Family and community life became somewhat more stable, although it remained much more fragmented and individualistic than what we see in the North. Improved survival rates also meant that more indentured servants lived out their terms of service and became free. By this time, older settlers had taken the best land along the coast, making it difficult for the freedmen to establish themselves as independent landowning farmers. Increasingly, Chesapeake society was divided between a wealthy and powerful elite who owned the estates in the Tidelands region, which provided easy access to transportation, and the poorer folk in the backcountry. This particularly became an issue in Virginia, and in the 1670s, this class of poor landless settlers began demanding that the government open up land to the west through a war with the natives. Governor William Barclay refused, in part to protect the lucrative fur trade that he and his cronies had developed with the tribes to the west. In June of 1676, a colonist named Nathaniel Bacon led a small army of settlers into Jamestown, the colony's capital, demanding authorization from the governor to start a war with the natives. Governor Barclay, intimidated by this display of force, agreed. However, when Bacon and his army marched away, Barclay changed his mind and declared him a rebel. 3 months later, the rebels returned to Jamestown, captured it, and burned it, forcing Barclay to flee. Soon thereafter, Bacon died of dysentery, and the rebellion collapsed. Tensions between the colonial elites in Virginia and the poorer backcountry farmers did ease over the next few decades, partially because Bacon's rebellion had been successful in wiping out a good portion of the Indian population that stood in the way of further westward growth. This period also saw the growth in the institution of slavery in the South. There are several key reasons why slavery expanded at this time. Conditions in England were actually improving, making it harder to recruit indentured servants. Those that did come generally preferred to travel to the middle colonies, not to the South. Bacon's rebellion had also illustrated the problems created when indentured servants became freedmen. Slavery solved these problems, since slaves never became free. Declining mortality rates also encouraged the growth of slavery. The initial cost to purchase a slave was 5 to 6 times greater than that of acquiring an indentured servant. With people dying left and right, most plantation owners realized that it was unlikely that a slave would live long enough to justify the higher initial cost. However, with a declining death rate, slavery became more economically viable. Planters could also count on the natural increase among the people held in captivity to ensure additional profits from the children born into slavery. This system clearly benefited plantation owners, but led to misery for the people forced into slavery. Since the establishment of European settlements in the Americas, the slave trade with Africa had boomed. Local African rulers provided most of these slaves. They sold captives to European traders, who then packed their human cargoes into ships and transported them across the Atlantic in what became known as the Middle Passage. Crammed into dark holes with little sanitation or water, many did not survive the journey. Upon arrival in the Americas, they were bound into a lifetime of servitude. In the sugar islands of the Caribbean and the plantations of Brazil, the mortality rate was horrific. With profits from sugar so high, the planters often simply worked their slaves to death and then imported new ones. On the North American mainland, conditions were somewhat better, and here Africans held in bondage were more likely to be able to form families. Some were even able to become free, ultimately forming a significant minority of the African American population in the colonies. African Americans held in bondage did rebel in a number of ways against slavery. In some cases they did this by running away, forming their own hidden communities in unexplored areas of the West, or by joining with Native American tribes. Many African Americans, for instance, fled from Georgia into Spanish Florida, where they merged with the Seminoles. Outright uprisings were comparatively rare, but they did occur. The most famous example was the Stono Rebellion, which broke out in South Carolina in 1739. Rebellions were harshly suppressed. In South Carolina, for instance, rumors of a slave uprising in 1740 led to the torture and hanging of 50 African slaves, whose decapitated heads were posted on poles to give warning to other potential insurrectionists. Other regions, such as New England, witnessed changes as well. From the beginning, the New England climate had been much healthier than the Chesapeake, encouraging rapid population growth. By the second part of the 17th century, this created some significant problems. Initially, there had been abundant land available, and fathers were typically able to provide farms for their sons out of their own estates. This ensured that New England settlements remained tightly knit, with families settled in close proximity. As the original land grants were divided and subdivided, however, the size of farms shrank to the point that it became more and more difficult for individual farmers to make a living. Hungry for land, the growing population looked outward. They were constrained by the presence of French colonists to the north and powerful native tribes to the west. This fueled the fragmentation of New England society as sons increasingly moved away, either seeking land in the dangerous territories of the west or moving south into the middle colonies. Expansion to the west played a role in the sharp escalation of tensions with Native Americans. Early on, the settlers had benefited from native populations decimated from disease and strategic alliances with tribes like the Narragansetts. However, by the 1650s, many tribes were increasingly concerned at the growing strength of European settlers and their aggressive demands for land. In 1674, the Wampanoag Confederacy, under the leadership of Chief Metacom, known to the settlers as King Philip, organized a confederation of tribes and launched a massive surprise attack upon settlements in Massachusetts. This war lasted for more than a year. While the natives ultimately lost, the impact upon English settlers was devastating. Warfare also took a heavy toll on New England because of its proximity to New France. By the late 17th century, the French were increasingly interested in limiting the expansion of the English colonies, and while the actual French colonial population remained quite small, they were much more successful in recruiting native allies. This reflected the rather different character of New France, whose principal economic activity lay in the fur trade rather than agriculture. They had little need for Indian land, but instead strove to develop positive relationships with the natives to encourage their participation in the fur trade. With these allies, the French launched numerous raids against New England in the period from 1690s through the 1730s, as part of larger conflicts with England.